antes de lo que va a ser la pausa de mediodía, se van a suceder dos ponencias, una de Ricardo González, historiador del arte y fotógrafo, bien conocido también por el equipo del Museo de la Universidad, tanto por Rafa Levenfeld como por Asunción Domeño y por todos nosotros, y que además ha colaborado ya en algunas de las publicaciones del Museo, como es en el libro Tiempos de Hierro, ¿no? Bienvenida a los asistentes y, por supuesto, a los ponentes de esta jornada intensa, donde vamos a ver aspectos muy variados, bastante interdisciplinares, fruto de una investigación y un itinerario detrás de estos rastros de nitrato y de la mano del propio Xavier Rivas, ¿no? Aunque comenzamos con la ponencia de Louise, Purbrick y Xavier Rivas, que explicarán y contextualizarán realmente cuál es la dimensión de este proyecto, yo sí que quería mencionar, aunque sea brevemente, las circunstancias en las que se genera este proyecto, ¿no? Xavier fue invitado a la universidad, al entonces Fondo Fotográfico, para trabajar dentro del programa curatorial Tender Puentes, y aunque realmente ese programa que dialoga, donde se fomenta ese diálogo contemporáneo entre creadores, entre fotógrafos actuales y la colección, sobre todo, de fotografía española del Fondo Fotográfico, no tuvo, digamos que él no utilizó lo que es el material que hoy nos ocupa. Sí que le llamó la atención un álbum referido a la explotación de nitratos, a la extracción de nitratos en Chile, un álbum fotográfico que también, igual que la fotografía, igual que el capital y que el propio nitrato, forma parte de una serie de flujos globales de circulación que, desde luego, fomenta o genera paralelismos y concomitancias bastante interesantes, también fisuras espaciotemporales, ¿no? Este seminario, que tiene lugar hoy aquí en Pamplona, tuvo su correlato el sábado pasado en Barcelona, en el MACBA, con algunas variaciones en el programa, pero sí que en ambas ediciones, por así decir, va a quedar clara también las conexiones que este tipo de materiales y este tipo de reflexiones generan tanto con el presente actual y algunos aspectos de la fotografía actual, como con el pasado incluso más remoto. Sí que quería hacer referencia a la sesión inaugural del Seminario de Pamplona, de Max Hinderer, uno de los comisarios de la exposición Principio Potosí del Reina Sofía de hace unos años, donde se establecieron, pues, ciertos paralelismos entre esa circulación de las materias primas y del capital, esa acumulación del capital que se produce por vez primera en el siglo XVI en el contexto de la monarquía hispánica, ¿no?, y del gobierno de Felipe II, la circulación del arte andino también y la gestación de un arte bastante particular como es el el barroco andino latinoamericano, que también tiene sus códigos de circulación, y a la vez, después de lo que es el análisis más concreto de las circunstancias de este álbum, en el caso de Andrea Joss, que tampoco puede estar hoy aquí, pero cuya ponencia veremos, se establecieron algunos nexos con la fotografía o con algunos códigos o algunos temas, algunos registros en los que se mueve la fotografía actual. Bueno, yo me callo porque, en primer lugar, quería agradecer a Xavier y a Louise su presencia aquí. Ambos son profesores en la Universidad de Brighton, en la Facultad de Arte. Louise es historiadora del arte y Xavier es conocido por todos también como fotógrafo, y son realmente los que han mostrado la voluntad de que esta investigación sea presentada aquí. Están inmersos también en un proyecto que se materializará en una exposición coproducida por el MACBA y el Museo de la Universidad de Navarra, y también son los artífices de la nómina de ponentes y de esta dinámica de trabajo interdisciplinar que veo hoy aquí o que se pone también a disposición de todos nosotros con su exposición pública. Gracias.
Gracias. I must apologize that my paper's read in English, but actually if you heard my Spanish, you might be quite grateful. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for your attendance this morning. On the 18th of July, 1890, Mr. Smale wrote to Henry Hucks Gibbs. He addressed him by his title, My Dear Lord Aldenham, I'm sending you herewith an album of views of Alianza and Iquique, which I would ask you to accept as a souvenir of our last, but I hope not least, among nitrate officinas. The views were taken about the middle of last year. Mr. Smale was manager of nitrate companies mining in Chile owned by the merchant house of Anthony Gibbs and Sons. Henry Hucks Gibbs, Lord Aldenham, was the head of the merchant house. The album, which has the title Oficina Alianza and Port of Iquique 1899 embossed on its cover, contained around 90 photographs of the nitrate industry in the Atacama desert of Chile, and it concludes with panoramas of the nitrate ports. The album contains one image that has become associated with the commemoration of a strike of nitrate workers in 1907 and the killing of Santa Maria. This image circulates far beyond its position in the album. It's digitised and deployed on blogs commemorating the history of unionisation and the terrible deaths of thousands of nitrate workers. The researchers involved in the Traces of Nitrate project have found this image very compelling. It allows us to see, or at least glimpse, the real work, perhaps, of the nitrate trade. It contains what we might want to call the spark of contingency in Walter Benjamin's words. Walter Benjamin says, from the 1930s, says, no matter how artful the photographer, no matter how carefully posed his subject, the beholder feels an irresistible urge to search such a picture for a tiny spark of contingency, of the here and now, which reality has so to speak seared the subject, to find the inconspicuous spot where the immediacy of that long-forgotten moment, the future subsists so eloquently that we, looking back, may rediscover it. Well, maybe, hopefully. But my paper today examines the Oficina, Alianza and Port of Iquique as an album that's held here in Navarra, as a sequence of images and as an object of exchange. Its focus, the focus of my paper, is rather sweeping. It halts only on a few images of the nearly 90 in order to reflect upon the photographic forms and their place in the trafficking of nitrate between Chile and Britain, and between Mr. Smale and the Oficinas and the house, the merchant house in London. The first image of the album, which opens Pampa and Oficina views, has number 1 scratched onto its surface, and it is, I would suggest, one of the most important of the album. Initially, it may appear rather blank. An empty sky, a pale sepia produced by the collodion printing process, hangs over a flat desert, which is only a little darker in colour. The rocky surface creates some shadow, and the 19th century camera has captured details of the surface of the desert. The land is textured, but emptiness of the sky is foregrounded beneath and below it. The tracks of the railway line establish lines of perspective. Along the left of the image, the right-hand track is a long straight line with a dark, sharp shadow, and it propels the village of the viewer of this first image of Oficina and Oficina Alianza and the Port of Iquique to a building and then a wall. The wall is also distinguishable because its shape is darker and straighter than the surface of the desert. And the wall cuts across the horizon where the desert fades into the sky, providing another line of sight through a series of structures. One is clearly a large shed, others are less distinct, but they draw our attention across the image towards a distant factory building. Entitled General View of Grounds and Works, this first image prepares the viewer for the following 90 images. It sets the scene, indicates everything that's in store. So rather than blank and empty, the flat image is actually quite full and dynamic. The railway tracks generate a geometrical order. The lines square off the image. The photographic arrangement of the view posits an industrial topography. It shows a worked and controlled landscape. Within the measured boundary, the uneven surface of the desert becomes a nitrate field, one of the grounds of industry, to use the word of the image's title. They are furthermore lines of movement, visual and geographical trajectories. Their destination on the far right of the horizon, the furthest from the near left where the lines start, is the Oficina. Its smoking chimney is a sign, or maybe more precisely an index of industrialisation. The visual path of the viewer simulates that of the train on which the photographer, carrying his camera and other photographic paraphernalia, would have certainly travelled. So train, photographer, with those who flicked through the album trailing behind both, hundreds of years but still behind them, are heading for the Oficina. The opening images of the album promises a journey, and a journey does indeed unfold through the album. The first 40 images trace the mining, processing and transport of nitrate. So from desert rock, a mineral deposit, caliche, lying just beneath the surface, to a chemical bagged and ready for export. Each image is a stage of extraction, of refining of nitrate, and a different view of the desert. Each is a new geographical frame. As the nitrate changes its material state, it crosses the landscape. When the nitrate is loaded onto the train to leave the desert, the movement of the camera and the gaze of the viewer that falls behind the camera rests on the Oficina itself. A tour of the nitrate works and nitrate town then opens with a general view of the stores. It includes the iodine house and images of workers' housing, to end with the administrator's house. Now this sequence that I've just shown is about 20 photographs. And the sequence functions as an interlude. The image which immediately follows this, the selection of which seems to kind of herald film techniques, is the arrival of the train in Iquique. And the train pulls sacks of nitrate across the desert, arrives here, and it's as if the nitrate, the tour, which we saw earlier, and these are just selections, it's as if that tour took place while the train was travelling across the desert. So the images are not only geographical frames, they're also time frames. And when the train enters Iquique, the viewers rejoin the nitrate's journey in the next sequence, so a sequence of 10 images, shows nitrate moved from vehicle to vehicle, stack to stack, train to warehouse, warehouse to dock, lighters to vessels. So it shows the movement as an export. So nitrate's loaded, unloaded, weighed, and loaded again, and any one of the images in this sequence provides evidence of exports, a measurement of the quantity of nitrate. The effect of this sequence is cumulative. Piles upon stuff is a representation of wealth. The Oficina, Alianza and Port of Iquique presents a photographic sequence that is spatial, material and temporal, so desert to sea, rock to commodity. And the narration of nitrate's industrial process is a journey over time, one moment in the nitrate industry to another. But all of it, it seems to me, takes place under an unchanging sky. Its duration, the duration of the journey, is indeterminate. And our photographer, who we never see, rather disembodied photographer, offers images not just of time but of history. And there's an evocation in the journey of historical time. Within it, there is a chronological sequence which turns an industrial process, I think, into an idea of historical progress as well as just chronological time. So each photographed industrial stage are time frames, but also, I think, historical frames. The second image of the album, so I'm returning to go back through the journey in more detail. The second image of the album, so it follows the first image I've talked about already, is entitled Virgin Nitrate Grounds, and it is almost featureless. A photograph of nothing, almost no event, no action. It consists of only two blocks of colour, a pale earth and a paler sky. It displays the desert as a vast, empty expanse, an uninhabited landscape waiting for something to happen. The human figure is scaled small against the desert to demonstrate both its emptiness and its readiness. The two men on horses are positioned in the centre of the photograph. Their forms are indistinct, only an outline is discernible. The horses, we can just about tell, are held, one by the reins, facing each other, angled to form a gateway into the desert and the vanishing point between them. Across from each other, the men look into the distance. The profile of their clothed bodies, with the shape of their hats and not their faces, indicate figures turned away from the camera and drawing the viewer's gaze to as far as the eye can see, to a vanishing point. The undisturbed surface of the empty desert spreads out before them. In this moment in time, there is no smoking chimney, no signs of industry. So in his time, in the real time, if you like, of the photographer, he simply moved his camera away from the Oficina Alianza. It's already working and it's an already functioning nitrate works. It's a fully operational Oficina. And he was heading towards that on the journey on the train. But here he's produced another view of the desert as the past of the Oficina. Thus his sequencing of photographs becomes an outline of the industrialization of the desert itself. It shows the industrial transformation of the Atacama as a historical as well as an everyday operation. And over the next 7 images, things start to happen. History, if you like, starts to happen. The photographs contain activity. Men balanced on the desert's rocky surface or bent over, levering out rocks in open trenches. Mules ready to pull carts of caliche. And each image records an event in the surface mining of nitrate, including an explosion, blasting the test hole, as the image is titled. But they remain desert views. All of these are desert views. And expansive ochre fields under large empty skies. The desert landscape dominates until the arrival of technology. Or put less dramatically, the view changes as industrial structures such as machinery become the object of the camera, the subject of the image. So the 10th image presents a railway engine. It's at halt and there's steam spurting from the pipe. The chain of trucks pulled behind it spans almost the entire horizontal plane of the image. Human figures, these are calicheros, human figures, nitrate workers, form the background of the railway engine and the trucks. And at first glance, they appear without much arrangement. They stand between the carts or on their horses, and they're performing, as the image says, the loading of caliche onto the railway trucks, so the loading of the mineral. Now, rather than... We could see the image, first of all, initially as unarranged, but on closer inspection, you can see how each of the workers are patiently presenting themselves and their stocks of caliche as a picture of industrial plenty and, to some extent, worker passivity. They're presenting themselves to the photographer, whose position, we can probably tell from the image, is below left, bottom right from the viewer's perspective. So if you follow the gazes, you can tell roughly where the photographer would be stood. So he's on the bottom right, I would say. Now, have they been waiting for his signal to release the back panel of the cart and raise it so he could capture the falling caliche? The blurred shape of moving materials, the dust cloud that indicate a material transformation have taken place, avalanches of nitrate in its changing forms, is one of the dramas of the album. And it features several times within the album. Tipping, falling caliche is captured again and again as the train arrived inside the works, some 6 images later. So the 16th image of the album, which we're looking at here, demonstrates the different photographic rendering of land and industry. So the view here has changed. The depth of field is much smaller, and the interactions between people and materials is brought much closer to the viewer, and it's created a crowded scene. There's an increase of industrial activity or productivity, to use the economic term, and this is not simply a matter of the content of the image, but of the structure of the lens through which it's seen. This image, I would say, is a very well-organised image of industry. Tracks, girders, planks, the railway carrying carts of caliche and the regular openings of the crusher extend from bottom left to the centre, providing lines of perspective around which the elements of the image are drawn into symmetry. At the very centre of the image, at the destination of the lines of perspective, is its defining movement, its industrial stage, so the tipping and falling of caliche. But all around is represented by activity and by quantity. So men occupy purposeful positions within the industrial architecture, and they oversee the mounds of material. 3 men each hold the cart in the centre of the image as dusty rocks pour from the bottom and spill from the top. The face of the foremost figure, whose leaning body is aligned with the cart to become part of the shape of the movement of the tipping caliche, is turned upwards towards the camera. His glance punctures the image, alerting its viewers, us, sitting here right now, that this moment is being presented. It has not just happened. But the image's other elements also combine to encourage a dismissal of this look and its small incidental challenge to the documentary claims of 19th century industrial photography. The cart and its handlers might have halted for the camera, but heavy loads stacked up behind them reassure us, or the 19th century viewers, the early 20th century viewers of the album, that the sight of a tipping cart of caliche is a routine of nitrate processing. The movement of materials that takes place centre stage is repeated. Dust cloud pours from a mule-drawn cart in the top right of the image. It offers another moment of symmetry. The same dimensions are raised to the same angle in this cart, but its movement is less overtly observed than that along the image's main line, the centre stage image. Here, above, the tipping cart was certainly timed and perhaps even performed for the camera, but the viewer can see enough to assume that this happens all the time. Thus, the 16th image is received as representative. It achieves the representativeness necessary for a document. So the journey, geographical and industrial, presented in Oficina, Alianza and Port of Iquique is not merely the record of where the photographer stood, nor is the narrative, the industrial story of nitrate his invention. I am assuming the photographer is male, but I don't know his name or any other signs of his identity. Records of him have not been lost or overlooked. His anonymity is a type of historical accuracy of a kind. The photographer cannot be distinguished as an individual practitioner because his work reproduces standard photographic forms of the late 19th century. The sequences of images has been, I've suggested, created, and there's some considered editing. Then numbering and renumbering is often discernible on some of the plates, as it is on here. So this is, I think, a renumbered image. I think it was 21, and it's been turned into 17. The numbering is discernible on the plate, but the composition of the views of the desert landscape and nitrate industry dutifully follows the conventions of 19th century photographic practice. The extraordinary spaces of the Atacama desert are presented as industrial scenes like other industrial scenes. The desert is framed through the practice of industrial photography, which was well established by the time the album was compiled in 1889. So historian, the British historian of industrial drawing and industrial photography, Francis Pugh, states, during the latter half of the 19th century, industrial photography became one of the principal means for recording and publicising the achievements of British industry, so that by 1900 there was hardly an industrial sector which did not make use of photography in one form or the other. It was from the mid-19th century that photographers with some kind of professional status, so members of photographic societies or literary and philosophical societies, were commissioned by engineers or contractors to produce photographic records of large-scale industrial schemes. Typically, these were ambitious structural interventions upon landscapes that were documented, bridges or tunnels for railway lines primarily. And Henry Flather, construction of the Metropolitan and District Railway, which I'm going to show some images, in 1856 to 68, so mid-19th century engineering works in London, is what I would suggest is quite an important example of this kind of photographic practice in a British context. I think it's important not because it's exceptional, but actually because it's quite common, in some ways a kind of typical industrial images. So Henry Flather produced 64 images, and I would say these contribute in part to some of the conventions of industrial photography. And I'm going to just talk about two images. One, which is held in the Museum of London, is called The Cutting of the Line at Notting Hill. And it's a perfectly arranged scene of industry. And Flather deploys pictorial, picture-making practices to provide a frame through which industry can be represented. He organises the view of industry. He brings an order to the disorder of unfinished industrial work. So his photograph has a formal arrangement of a landscape painting. A left to right, top to bottom axis creates movement across a picture plane. On either side of the axis, the railway cutting and the subject of the photograph along exposed surface of dark dug earth and lighter rocky shelves lie heaps of stuff, piles of wooden planks awaiting use, barrows of blocks to be carried away. An unfinished scene is drawn into a balanced arrangement. A symmetry between two cranes suggests an archway across the cutting. The heaps of temporary discarded stuff form geometrical patterns, repeating rectangles or lines of isosceles triangles. The unfinished nature of the scene is busy, but it is not chaotic. It's an image of the moment of material transformation. And human figures have a very small part in the scene. They stand within its industrial structures as if in placements belittled by amounts of material and the scale of industry and industrial transformation. Another flat image of another London transport engineering scheme, so this is Bayswater in London in the 1860s, is captioned a gang of workmen around a steam crane removing spoil from the excavation at Craven Hill. And it has the human figure, the worker's body, as its subject. These men are all turned to face the photographer. The camera and the shapes of light upon the photographic plate, which were then fixed in chemicals, they look at the photographer and they look at us. They've been positioned in ascending and descending order around the crane. Another balanced and classical painterly arrangement, so another triangle, if you like. The pictures form sight lines from left to right into the centre of the image, to the cogs and wheels and the pulley mechanism, to the steam pipe atop all. The group of labouring men presents the technology of industrial work, and they present themselves. They hold poses from which their forms of industrial labour can be read from their bodies. The chest of the foreman, positioned in the centre, fills out his waistcoat to demonstrate his command. The wide stance, the lunge of the white-jacketed worker. He has his front leg bent, his shovel held against his straight back leg. He displays not simply the type of manual work, so he's a labourer, but also his preparedness, his readiness for labour. Unlike other images, they don't have, and this is the final Flather image, they don't have their backs bent in labour. We see that they have stopped for the moment of the photograph, but labour is still the subject. It's still the subject of the image. I selected some of these images because they correspond. So there's a correspondence of formal arrangement between Flader's images and those in the Oficina, Alianza and Porto of Iquique album. But I'm not really arguing that the photographer in Chile necessarily looked at or knew Flader's work. And since I don't know the photographer's name, I couldn't begin to make a guess about this. But my case is that when he, in 1899, when the photographer of the album held here in Navarra, when the cameraman arranged his tripod on the uneven surface of the rocky desert and pointed his heavy camera towards an empty landscape before turning to focus on the operations of machinery, a way of picturing industry was already in place. Furthermore, by the 1880s, according to Francis Pugh, the photographic documentation of industrial works had become part of industrial work itself, often organised directly by the engineer, the contractor or the company carrying it out. So Francis Pugh argues that the engineer photographer by the 1880s had become a more familiar figure. So if we wanted to find clues to the identity of the photographer, we could turn back to the album itself. Sorry, my images are out of order. We could turn back to the album itself, and here's the laboratory, and I would say there's a greater deal of intimacy in this image that shows at least some correspondence between both the person taking the photograph and the subject of the photograph. So he's at ease within these spaces, and I'd argue that somehow you could read a shared social position between photographer and photographic subject in this image. And in fact, he must have had somewhere to develop his photographs in the Oficina because of the speed necessary for the particular type of printing. So the photographs in all likelihood were developed in the Oficina and not back in Iquique, I would guess. Nevertheless, the anonymity of the photographer and his composition of the photographs in accordance with techniques of industrial photography and compositional arrangement secures, I think, an important reading of industrialization. The industrial process is produced not really by the arrangements of the images, that's the illusion, but actually because that's the way it always happens. So the narrative of desert rock into raw material, land into commodity, appears as a proper historical order. It's simply that the photographer had made that evident. It is, of course, contingent. So all these are contingent on the relationship between the photographer and the company in Alianza. And so we could say that these images are absolutely bound up with the trafficking and trade in nitrate. It not only traces it, but the photographer is part of the industrial process that he represents. And so, and if we wanted some confirmation of this, this is Smell, the giver of the album, and his signatures on documents that move between London and Chile. So he's signing off accounts from nitrate companies here. So this is Smell, the author of the letter, inside the album that's held here. And this is his signature on documents in the London Metropolitan Archives. So it's part of an exchange or correspondence that includes statistical representations of wealth as well as photographic ones. So, given locating the album in this exchange of industry and documentation between London and Chile, where might we find that Walter Benjamin's spark of contingency in this album? And we could look for it in a number of different places, and where I would seek to find it is in the folds of the clothes of the nitrate workers, which if you look at the album and if you look at the actual image rather than its reproduction, you can see a greater degree of surface. But for me, I think what's important is the way in which part of the history of nitrate is not simply in the photograph itself, but in the capturing of the clothing. So I don't know if you can see from here, but if you look at the hands of the workers around the shovels that they hold are wrapped in fabric, similarly to the way in which the fabric is wound around their waist, or their socks have fabric that's wound around. And it gives us some indication of some small trace, if you like, or some spark of the salt and the dust and the sharp and the dirt of the ripio, the waste that they were shoveling away. So it's the material conditions are also held, therefore, in the fabrics of the nitrate workers' clothing and the material relations of nitrate mining that may be visible as the spark of contingency in one of these images. Thank you.